So anyway, we began last week talking about swimming upstream, about living for Christ in a culture that sometimes might get us discouraged. And we're going to continue that today as far as how to do that. And we're going to learn some lessons, just 3 lessons from a man named Daniel and 3 other individuals that you are very familiar with, as you will see. But as we begin, let's read from Daniel chapter 1. And even though we'll spend a good amount of our time in Daniel 3, we're going to read the first 8 verses of Daniel chapter 1. And we're going to talk about, well, I need to get us a little bit of a historical perspective on what's going on as we do this. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And of course, this is reading out of the ESV, English Standard Version, and the page number on the screen is the same page number in one of the Bibles in front of you. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. That means they were to serve him, to do whatever he wanted them to do. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Now, probably Daniel, we're so aware of his name, but the other 3, we know them really in a different light, and that's found in the next verse. The chief of the eunuchs, this is part of the whole retraining, re-education of these Jews, was to give them new names. The chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. And I'm going to ask you to pray with me again, okay? Father, thank you for your word. I just pray as we look into it, as we see these young men, Lord, and the stand they took, that you will, for us, that we will get some practical advice on how to live. Just pray you would be with us and watch over us. Be with those that are working with our kids as they teach the children, and just thank you for their sacrifice in that. Thank you for all that people do at Oakridge. It's your name we ask it. Amen. There are a lot of people in our church that have moved all over the place. We know that there are some that moved from Germany a number of years ago. Some here have moved from one coast to the other in the continental United States. I just, you can Google anything. It's just unbelievable. So I thought, well, how far is it? Now, see, this is very important for you. How far is it from Berlin, Germany to St. Joe, Michigan? And if you come up with the answer, well, there's no prize, but 4,348 miles, straight line. We moved from Sacramento originally to Nebraska, ended up in St. Joe, 2,124 miles, and some of you have traveled farther than that. But I want you to just go back in time with me to when Daniel and his friends are going to be taken from Jerusalem and moved to Babylon. No planes, no trains, no cars. They're going to travel 1,600 miles. That's a long journey. Just to give you a little background, grab your outline. Let me set the stage for what we're going to read. I think it's important that we understand the situation. When Solomon the king died, Israel was divided into 2 nations. The northern kingdom was known as Israel. The southern kingdom was known as Judah. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom fell. Didn't exist after that. There was never in the northern kingdom of Israel a good king. There wasn't. There was never a king that cared about what God thought. There was never a king that was concerned about spiritual things. And I think that's one of the reasons why it fell before the southern kingdom, because the southern kingdom did have a handful of kings that loved God, all right? And so you have these two nations. The southern kingdom eventually fell in 586 BC. But about 20 years prior to that, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, of the Assyrian Empire, began to attack Israel in different places and to make raids into the nation. And in about 605, 604 BC, he attacked Jerusalem. It was at that time that Daniel and a number of Jewish young people were taken to Babylon. They were taken there because they were sharp, they were, smart, knowledgeable. And so they are moved from their homeland that they knew so well to a place that had nothing in common with their culture. The goal of the Babylonians, as we see, even as you read verse 4, youth without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, competent to stand in the king's palace. Here's the goal. We're going to teach the Jews the literature and the language of the Chaldeans, but that would include more than that. This was to re-educate them, to basically replace everything they believed and knew with a whole different set of values, a whole different set of gods, everything. That's the way that many of those ancient empires operated. When they captured a country, their goal was to retrain you or make you like them. That's the land that Daniel and his buddies are taken to. The one thing that we're going to see as we get into this, that Daniel he didn't take a stand on every issue that came along. I think sometimes in culture, Christians want to fight about everything. Or we got to make sure that everybody knows what we stand on every little thing. And I do think there are some issues that anything that's biblically an issue, you better take a stand for. And that's what Daniel did. But he didn't get into it about everything. If he was learning a new style of math or whatever by the Babylonians, he didn't make a big deal about that. But when it came to biblical truth, then he did say, wait a minute. We know what they were looking for. We just read it. They were looking for young people that were smart, understanding, competent, the whole thing. What I'm more interested in is how these young people that were either in their late teens or early 20s, Daniel and the others, how they handled the cultural pressure that is being put on them. And I think there are 3 lessons I want to share this morning before we do communion that I think are valuable to you and I. It doesn't matter how old we are. It doesn't matter where we are in life. Okay? So let's look at them. Here's the first. It's right there on your notes. If you want to stand up for something and what you believe, you got to be determined to do that. And you got to have knowledge. You need to know what you believe, why you believe. You need to understand issues and all that. We talked about that. But I want you to see something about Daniel in verse 8. All right? Here's this young man, and they've been told that, they want to get put on a certain food diet and all this. I'm going to explain this because to you and I, it's not going to seem like a big deal, but to Daniel and the others, it will be what they were asked to eat. But it says something very interesting about Daniel in verse 8. Daniel did something. My Bible has the word resolved. Okay? So here's this young man who makes a decision. The word resolved comes from 2 Hebrew words. And it carries the idea of setting the mind or the heart on something. It's a decision. It's a determination. So Daniel, even before all this stuff starts being pressed on him, He's already in his mind determined how he's going to respond. And it's based on what he believes. It's based on what he knows. All right? And so here are they. If you're going to stand for culture, you have to be proactive in what you believe and not reactive. And you have to be proactive in standing and being determined in your mind, being resolved. You know what? I'm not going to allow the world swirling around me to control me or to wreck my life or to change me. You have to know what you believe. We talked about that last week. His mind was made up. It doesn't imply that we live in a cocoon, because we're out in the world. We're around people that are not going to agree with us. But I'll tell you this, we don't have our minds made up on that what we believe matters. It's easy to surrender, just surrender and give in. Daniel decided no matter what, and it's on your outline, he's not going to go against his beliefs. Right? So you say, look, it says verse 8, Daniel resolved that he would not do something, defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. And so you're thinking to yourself, what big deal, talking food. For the Jews, the Old Testament law was very clear on what they should eat and shouldn't eat. The food the Babylonians offered probably in many ways didn't line up with what the Jews believed. Not only that, the majority of the food the Babylonians would offer you would have been offered on some sacrifice for idols. And so you're being asked for the Jew to eat food that had been sacrificed to idols. And Daniel and them knew they couldn't do that. So for you and I, you're thinking big deal. But for Daniel and them, it was a big deal because of what they believed, what they held to. And I'm going to just say it, and we knew that. Everybody here has a world view. Whether you've written it down or you haven't written it down, a worldview is the lens by which you see everything around you. Every person has a worldview. It's that decision, it's how you filter things out. It's how you make decisions and what you believe and what you hold to. For me, as a Christian, my worldview is formed by the Bible, which I think passes every test for historical accuracy and all of that. So if you don't know where you stand and what your worldview is, then we're going to get kind of blown around by everything that comes along. Our worldview shapes the decisions we make. It may not be an issue about food, but I've had no problem speaking out on what I think of things like euthanasia and abortion and all that. I've written about this on blogs and all, my view on abortion and these type of things, and my view of prayer and church life and all that. Same thing with you, because we have to know, because so many things are being questioned and challenged in our culture. And as a Christian, you're going to hear all kinds of stuff. And even in America, as we said last week, Christianity is being marginalized. It's being pushed to what we call the borderlands of society. But I think in the end that this is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think it drives us closer to God, in my opinion. Should anyway. But here they are. But if you're going to stand against culture, you got to have determination, and that's only something we can decide to do. And knowledge. We have to know what we believe. All right? There's a second thing. I'm amazed at the conversation that occurs. This is the hardest thing to do. And that is be respectful to those we might disagree with. You say, you mean you expect me to be respectful to the knuckleheads that I deal with? Or the things that I hear? What I've discovered is if I get in shouting matches with people, you know. It doesn't always work so well, and some people just lose their minds. If you say, well, I don't necessarily see that, I don't agree with that, next thing you know, I've had people call me names, people get rude, they try to bully you just simply because I don't agree with them, that I have a different opinion. I think it's good to talk about stuff. Talked about that last week. We talked about what the real meaning and definition historically of the word tolerance was. The idea that we can sit down and discuss things. But I don't want to get like this. I don't need to call people names. I don't need to tell them that, yeah, I disagree with them. But when I'm face to face, I need to, shall I say, take the high road, and that's not always easy to do because stuff is emotional, isn't it? It's emotional. There are certain issues that I have a firm stand on, partly because not only what I think the Bible says, but because I've lived it, or I've seen it in my family, extended family. You know? In Daniel 1, just look at the conversation. Verse 8, so Daniel asked this leader, chief of the eunuchs, to allow him not to defile himself. Now, he didn't get on the guy and say, well, you know, you guys are a bunch of losers here in Babylon. And so I don't want anything to do with this. It says in verse 9, God gave Daniel favor. Now, this was something here, too. God gave Daniel compassion and favor in the eyes of this man. And you say, well, that doesn't always happen to me, and that's true. It won't. But I like how Daniel handles it. When you go down to verse 11, Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over them, he just asked a question. He made a statement, test your servants for 10 days. He's being respectful. Says, let us be given vegetables to eat, water to drink. Then just let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. If you flip over your notes, I think it's really important to keep a couple of things in mind. So even when Daniel said this, I mean, he's being respectful and he's just asking a question. I mean, he's firm on where he's coming from. But the Jews knew this. The world knew this. In the ancient world, the king had absolute authority over life and death. It didn't stop Daniel and the others to not do what they did, didn't change what they believed. Daniel simply stated his case and left everything in God's hands. He was determined, said what he needed to say, and left it there. But he didn't get into a shouting match with this guy. He didn't get into all of that. I don't think we should live passively, and I don't think that's what this is teaching. I mean, these young people in Babylon took a risk, but they were willing to do so. They were bold, but respectful. And sometimes that's hard. It's hard to be respectful, because sometimes somebody says something, and I think, how dumb is that? And I want to say something like, you're really dumb. But I found that doesn't always work well to build the conversation on. You know what I mean? Well, you really are an idiot for thinking that. I mean, in my thinking, I might be thinking that really is dumb, but it doesn't mean I have to voice it to them. I can just say, well, that's interesting. Now, usually, though, when you voice your side, they may not like it, and then they start, not everybody gets into the name-calling thing, but some people do. I don't know. They just do. And I found that often people that get really worked up and get into the bullying, the name-calling, often what they believe cannot be objectively or factually supported, or they've got it in their mind, certain facts. And you might say, well, that's us too. Yeah. Well, like we said before, sometimes you have two diametrically opposed positions. We both can't be right. That's logical. It doesn't happen. It's called the law of non-contradiction. We talked about that. But just let me reference two passages, then we want to finish up in Daniel 3. In Romans 12, Paul gave some good advice. He said this. He said, live as much as is possible with you. Live peaceably with all men. And then he went on to talk about the fact that when somebody does something wrong to us, don't seek getting back at them. Don't avenge ourselves. Just simply be gracious and kind and let God deal with the situation. And then Proverbs 15:1 says, a soft answer turns away wrath or anger, okay? Now, I'm sure you're aware this. Proverbs is not a book of all these absolute promises, okay? In other words, let's be honest, have you ever been having a conversation with somebody and the voice level is rising? And then you start talking calmly, and then the voice level on the other side rises even higher. You ever done that? You're trying to be calm and collective, and they're going more and more apoplectic. They're losing it. But Proverbs, when Solomon wrote these were words of wisdom based on what practical observation. And often what does happen is if long as we just come back and show composure and, graciousness, somebody's going off on something and you say, well, I don't necessarily believe that. I hear your side, and you're talking normal, and sometimes it does have a way of calming down the situation. It's not a guarantee that it'll happen, but I know that when I get into shouting matches with other people and everybody's veins on their necks are bulging out, that it doesn't always work well. And when I read how Daniel, not only in Daniel 1, but again in Daniel 3, as we're going to see in a moment, that how we respond says more about us than it does about the people we're talking to. You say, oh, so you've never got fired up over an issue? Oh, yeah, I have. I have. But I'm trying, as you are, to handle things right. I don't have to agree with somebody. I mean, there are Christians that are good friends of mine that I disagree with on stuff. But I'm not going to get into shouting matches with them. When Jesus comes, they will discover the wrongness of their views. Just kidding. I'd like you to flip over 2 chapters. So I'm just saying that if you and I are going to live in the culture today, you have to have determination. You have to know what you believe and already be determined of what you're going to stand for. And then just be respectful. You don't have to accept the views of other people. You don't. But we don't have to get into the attitude that others might have with the rudeness and the name calling and the bullying. But the third and final thing is found in Daniel 3, and I think this story is absolutely amazing. Because even if you know what you believe and you're resolved to do it, you got to have courage to do it. You got to have the backbone to do it. I want you to see Daniel 3. You can't overlook the story itself as we wrap up this morning, that it takes courage to swim upstream. In the first 7 verses of Daniel 3, the king Nebuchadnezzar decides, I'm going to build a 90-foot statue. We don't know what it's of. It doesn't say what it's of, but he builds a 90-foot statue, and it's 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, and he says, listen, he says, when a certain music is played, you're going to have to bow down and worship it. Now, on your outline there, when I talked about courage, I want you to look at the second bullet point. What is courage? I mean, it's easy to say have courage. What is it? I love how the book Practical Christianity defines courage. It says it's, quote, the power to do well when the air is turbulent and the going gets tough. The power to do well when the air is turbulent and the going gets tough. It's gonna get tough in Daniel 3. In fact, these young men who now are known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been elevated to a place in the kingdom of Babylon in which they are higher up in the government. In fact, if you read Daniel chapter 2, verse 49, it says that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were put over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Daniel was one of Nebuchadnezzar's right-hand men. He stayed in the court. So here's this story. All of this is swirling around. Build a statue. Look what it says in verse 6. Whoever does not fall down worship shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. That's motivation right there. To bow down, right? And what is it? What's the repercussions? Get a little hot. For most people in Babylon, this is no big deal. It's not. They worship all kinds of gods. They've been trained. This is just another god. So if on their long list of gods, whatever statue you build, no biggie, we'll bow down and worship it. But Daniel and his buddies, especially these three men, no way. This takes courage. This takes determination. This takes guts. See, they could bend to the will of the world around them, or they could say no. So how does it unfold? Well, look at verse 8. It says that certain Chaldeans, there were people in Babylon that were jealous that these Jewish young adults have been put in places of leadership. So there's a lot of envy going on. It says they did something. They came forward and they maliciously accused the Jews. If you want another word, they slandered the Jews. It literally is a word in the Hebrew that means to tear to pieces. So they come to the king and they just lay it all out about how these three men refused to bow down to the statue. They knew that this was they weren't going to do it. And then, but here's what I really find fascinating is verse 12. Because these guys, when they came to the king, also put this back on the king. They basically are saying, all that we're about to tell you is your fault. Because after they relived for Nebuchadnezzar what he had said, if people don't bow down, you put them in the fiery furnace. Verse 12. Now, listen, king, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed. So basically, the problem that you have right now, good old King Nebuchadnezzar, you brought it on yourself. Because you put these guys in charge. You're responsible. I almost get the sense they're accusing the king of not knowing what he was doing. I don't know how smart that was, because the king could have said, you can join him in the fire. You don't question me. So they bring this, this is all being worked on. These guys, they've got this all planned out. So what happens? Look at how they say it in verse 12. These men, and they've named them. These other guys, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians have named them. These men, O king, they pay absolutely no attention to you. They don't serve your gods. They don't worship the golden image that you've set up. They don't do any of that. So what did Nebuchadnezzar do? Verse 13. He exploded. And he commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought to him. And they were. Don't miss the story in verse 14 and following. Let's read it. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up. Now, I'll give you a chance. If you're ready, when you hear the music, fall down, worship the image that I've made, everything is cool. But if you do not worship, guess what happens? You get to get an early suntan, you're going to get burned in the fiery furnace, and then there's a sense of arrogance. Into the verse 15, who's the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Nobody is as powerful as me. I'm the king of the greatest empire in the world at the time. You have no God that can set you free. Here's their response. I love verse 16. O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. They're not saying that God's going to spare their life, because if they're burned alive, they're taken to heaven. It says, God, whatever God chooses, we're delivered. They would not buckle down. But verse 18, if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods. That took courage. Or worship the golden image that you have set up. Their view of God was not based on him doing what either they wanted or what someone else might think. Their view was based on the fact they believed that God was all-knowing. He was the sovereign boss of the universe. And whatever he decided, that's the way it was. You want to stand in the culture, it takes courage. You want to know who gives you courage? God does. He's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power. At the bottom there's three things you learn about courage from Daniel 3, and then we're done. We'll go do communion. Your mind's got to be made up about what you believe. There's no way these three guys could say what they said to the king unless they knew what they believed. Courage means you got to have a foothold in where you stand on something. It's crucial. Second, this is really important. No matter what, God is sovereign. He's in charge of everything. And sometimes when we look at the world around us, we think that can't be the case. But it is. When Nebuchadnezzar asked him what God would save them, these men were not worried about whether they'd be harmed or not. They simply said, God is who God is, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't mean I don't stand up for truth. It doesn't mean we don't speak out. It doesn't mean that we don't live for God in our culture and the world around us. But I also know that God is sovereign. And it is clear that one day Jesus will return to this earth. He will set his feet on the Mount of Olives, and things will be made right. There's a third thing. It's very easy to get caught up in the here and now. We look at the pressures around us, even they're put on us. These guys looked past the immediate. You know what they focused on? Eternal values. It doesn't mean they didn't live. It doesn't mean we don't live within and interact with the culture that might disagree with what you believe. But in the big picture, they weren't driven by what people thought or what the world around them thought. Their whole thing was, what does God think? That's the bottom line. You gotta know what you believe. You gotta be determined. You can't let things happening ruin your day, even though it's easy to do. It takes courage. And you know what? Like I'd say rise above the fray. Just work on taking the high road. You can agree to disagree with people, but just don't get caught up in handling it the way so many people seem to in our world today. The louder you scream, somehow people think people back down. Who wants to be yelled at? Anybody here like being yelled at? Nobody likes being yelled at. But I'm not going to go down that road. All right? Let's pray.
You can find more messages like this one at oakridgebc.org and like us on Facebook for encouragement and event updates right to your newsfeed. Thank you for listening to today's message from Oakridge Community Church.